In July 2025, an ROV moved slowly across the remains of the Japanese destroyer Yūdachi in Iron Bottom Sound. From a distance, parts of the wreck could still be placed within the shape of a warship. Up close, that shape often disappeared. Deck plating had collapsed. Large sections had folded into the seabed. An aft gun had fallen to port. Behind the surviving torpedo launcher positions, the stern had collapsed so completely that the ship seemed to dissolve into wreckage. This was not the first time Yudachi had been seen. Robert Ballard's expedition had found and documented the wreck in 1992. Another team, connected with Vulcan, imaged it again in 2015. Now, more than 3 decades after Ballard's visit, the Ocean Exploration Trust had returned with the research vessel Nautilus and the ROV Hercules. The purpose was not to raise Yudachi. Nobody was preparing cables, pumps, pontoons, or lifting frames. This was a non-invasive archaeological survey. The task was to map the site, record what remained, and compare the wreck with evidence left by earlier expeditions. That comparison revealed something important. Yudachi was not simply old, it was changing. The destroyer had already been violently damaged before it reached the seabed in 1942. But the wreck seen in 2025 showed significant deterioration beyond the condition recorded during earlier surveys. Some features were still identifiable, others had fallen, large sections had collapsed. And the longer the ROV remained over the site, the more obvious the central problem became. To understand what had vanished, the team first had to understand what had once been there. Yudachi was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Shiratsuyu-class destroyers. Like other ships of the class, she carried her main guns along a narrow destroyer hull and had 2 quadruple torpedo launchers positioned amidships. Those launchers were ordinary pieces of fighting equipment when Yudachi entered service. Decades later, they would become something very different. Landmarks that allowed underwater explorers to work out where they were on a wreck that was losing its original shape. The ship's final battle came in the waters around Guadalcanal in November 1942. By then, the campaign for the Solomon Islands had become a struggle not only for Guadalcanal itself, but also for the sea routes that kept forces on the island supplied. Japanese and American warships repeatedly entered the waters around Savo Island and Guadalcanal, often at night. The area would later become known as Iron Bottom Sound because of the number of ships lost there. On the night of November 12th and into the early hours of November 13th, Japanese and American formations collided at close range in the first phase of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The action was confused almost from the beginning. Ships crossed one another's tracks. Formations broke apart. Identification became difficult. Gunfire and torpedoes were exchanged at ranges far shorter than either side had intended. In that confusion, even reconstructing exactly which ship hit which opponent can be difficult. Yudachi was heavily involved. She launched torpedoes and engaged enemy ships, but the destroyer was also struck repeatedly. Hits damaged the bridge area and the machinery spaces. Power was lost. The ship became unable to continue normally. Some later accounts have raised the possibility that part of the damage may have come from Japanese fire in the confusion of the night battle. The surviving evidence does not allow that possibility to be treated as a certainty. What is clear is that by the end of the action, Yudachi was badly damaged and disabled. That matters to the wreck story. The ship did not sink as a complete undamaged hull that later rusted quietly on the seabed. It entered the water already weakened by battle. Another Japanese destroyer, Samidare, came alongside the crippled Yudachi. The practical problem was immediate. The damaged ship could no longer continue the operation, and saving the surviving crew became more important than saving the hull. A tow was considered, but Yudachi could not be recovered under the conditions of the battle. Most of the surviving crew were taken off. 26 men had been killed. 207 survived. Yudachi was left behind. but she was still afloat. Later that morning, USS Portland encountered the abandoned destroyer. Portland had suffered severe damage of her own and could not maneuver normally, yet she was still able to fire. Her shells struck Yūdachi. The final damage was more than a few additional holes in an already crippled ship. Fire reached the aft ammunition area. An explosion tore through the rear of the destroyer and devastated the stern. Only after that did Yudachi finally disappear beneath the surface. This single event would shape every later attempt to understand the wreck. When explorers eventually found the stern badly destroyed, they were not looking only at the work of corrosion. Part of that destruction belonged to the morning of November 13th, 1942. Then the wreck disappeared from human view for decades. Below the surface, there was no continuous record of what happened next. Steel corroded, sediment collected in some places and left others exposed. Marine life spread across surviving metal. Structures that had already been damaged remained vulnerable. But nobody was there to watch one deck fail, one support give way, or one gun mounting finally lose the structure beneath it. When Robert Ballard's expedition entered Iron Bottom Sound in 1992, it was returning human eyes to a battlefield that had been out of sight for half a century. Yudachi was one of the wrecks located and documented. The destroyer was already in rough condition. The bow forward of the first gun area had separated. The stern had suffered the catastrophic damage expected from the final explosion. The bridge was canted toward port. Parts of the superstructure were gone, yet the wreck was still interpretable. The hull remained upright. Major features could still be placed in relation to one another. An observer could look at the damaged structure and still understand the arrangement of the original ship. That distinction would become critical. During the 1992 work, Chuck Haberline of the Naval Historical Center produced hand drawings of wrecks examined in Iron Bottom Sound. These were not decorative illustrations. They were practical records, reducing complicated underwater scenes to clear lines. The orientation of the hull, surviving gun positions, collapsed sections, major breaks, and recognizable structures. For Yudachi, those lines captured a wreck that was damaged but still readable. At the time, nobody could know exactly how useful such drawings would become decades later. A photograph preserves what a camera saw from one angle. Video preserves movement through a scene. A drawing can do something different. It can strip away darkness, marine growth, and visual clutter and show how an observer understood the wreck as a whole. In 1992, that was documentation. By 2025, it had become a comparison point. There was, however, another visit in between. Yudachi was imaged again in 2015 by a team associated with Vulcan. That date matters because it prevents a tempting but misleading interpretation. It would be easy to compare 1992 directly with 2025 and assume that every fallen plate, every shifted component, and every collapsed deck changed slowly and evenly across 33 years. The evidence does not allow that. The 2015 visit tells us that the wreck was seen again, but the detailed condition record available for this story is not strong enough to assign every later collapse to a specific period. We cannot say with confidence that a particular structure fell in 1998 or 2017 or the year before Nautilus returned. The 2015 observation fills a point on the timeline. It does not fill every gap in the wreck's physical history. That uncertainty matters because shipwrecks do not necessarily deteriorate at a steady visible rate. One section may remain standing for years before failing. A deck may survive while nearby supports weaken. A heavy fitting may remain recognizable after lighter structure around it has disappeared. By the time Nautilus returned in July 2025, the expedition was bringing a different combination of tools to the site. The voyage, designated NA-173, surveyed a series of maritime heritage sites across Iron Bottom Sound. Yudachi was one of them. The process began before the close camera views that would later reveal individual pieces of wreckage. Hercules carried a multi-beam sonar system that could map the larger geometry of the wreck. This mattered because an ROV camera has a narrow view. At close range, even a large ship can become a confusing sequence of steel plates, holes, marine growth, and sediment. Sonar provided the wider frame. It allowed the team to understand the wreck's overall form before using the camera to inspect particular areas. Then, Hercules moved in. The ROV's route took it around the site, bringing the researchers from broad geometry into close visual evidence. This was where the older records became unusually valuable. The 2025 team had access to information produced from earlier work, including the hand drawings made after the Ballard expedition. Modern sonar, live ROV video, and lines drawn more than 30 years earlier could all be used to answer the same practical question. Where exactly are we on the ship? On an intact vessel, the answer could come from the line of the deck or the sequence of the superstructure. On Yudachi, those continuous references had been broken. A familiar object might be separated from the structure that once surrounded it, while an opening that looked important from the camera could be only one fracture among many. The wider sonar view and the older drawings reduced that ambiguity. They did not identify every fragment, but they helped place confirmed features back inside the original arrangement of the destroyer. That question sounds simple when a wreck is intact. On Yudachi, it was not. One of the clearest answers came from the torpedo launchers. As a Shiratsuyu-class destroyer, Yudachi had carried 2 quadruple launchers amidships. In 2025, the areas of both launchers remained identifiable enough to serve as major reference points. Their survival did not mean that the surrounding ship was well preserved. Quite the opposite. Around the launchers, much of the surrounding structure had deteriorated or collapsed. Components that had once been supported as part of a coherent warship now appeared isolated within wreckage that no longer followed the clean geometry of the original deck. This is one of the strange effects of an aging steel wreck. A large mechanical object may remain recognizable long after lighter surrounding structures have failed. The result is a wreck that can still be navigated, but only by jumping from landmark to landmark. Here's a torpedo launcher. There is a gun. Beyond it, the geometry becomes uncertain again. The aft gun provided another clear sign of change. By 2025, it had fallen to port. That single observation tells us more than a general statement that the wreck has corroded. A gun mounting is a heavy structure. For its position to change, the wreck around or beneath it had to change sufficiently for that movement to occur. The survey could document the result. It could not provide the exact moment when that failure happened. This distinction matters throughout Yudachi. The ROV shows what exists now. Earlier records show what existed then. The difference between the two is evidence of change. But the camera does not travel backward through time. It cannot tell us the precise year when each deck gave way. It cannot assign every fracture to corrosion rather than battle damage. And it cannot turn a plausible explanation into a proven one simply because the wreck appears fragile. The temptation to do that is strong because Yudachi's condition is so dramatic. Steel wrecks in seawater deteriorate through several interacting processes: alloy composition, oxygen, salinity, temperature, currents, sediment cover, biological activity, and the original condition of the metal can all influence what survives. For wrecks in Iron Bottom Sound, researchers have discussed average corrosion rates. But an average cannot tell us the history of every plate on one particular ship. Yudachi also began its time on the seabed with severe battle damage. The bridge had been hit. Machinery spaces had been damaged. The stern had been devastated by an ammunition explosion. Those facts are enough to show that the wreck did not begin from the same physical condition as an intact vessel. The 2025 survey did not establish one simple reason for everything that followed. It did not prove that Japanese ships as a group corrode faster than American ships. It did not establish a single corrosion rate for Yudachi. And it could not say exactly when each major structural failure took place. What it could do was show the outcome. That outcome became most obvious toward the stern. This was the part of Yudachi that had suffered the greatest destruction in 1942. By 1992, the damage was already severe. In 2025, Ocean Exploration Trust described the stern as fully collapsed. The ROV moved over a region where the original ship's form had largely disappeared. Instead of a clear run of deck and hull, there was broken structure, fallen material, and debris merged with the seabed. This is where the wreck stops looking like a destroyer and begins looking like a record of separate destructive events layered on top of one another. The first event was the battle. The second was the explosion that devastated the aft section before the ship sank. Then came decades underwater. Corrosion did not erase the earlier damage. It worked through what remained. Structures weakened, plating thinned. Parts that had survived the sinking eventually lost enough support to collapse or shift. The stern had been broken once in 1942. Time finished much of what remained. Yet even here, the survey has to resist a simple story. Not every twisted plate can be assigned to Portland shelling. Not every collapsed structure can be given a precise date. Some damage clearly came from the battle. Some change happened afterward. The exact sequence between individual surveys remains incomplete. That does not make the 2025 work less useful. It makes the documentation more important. A wreck like Yudachi is often spoken of as if it were a fixed historical object. A ship sinks, the wreck remains, and explorers later go to see it. But the site recorded in 1992 was not exactly the site recorded in 2025. The identity was the same. The physical object was changing. That means every survey captures only one moment in a much longer process. Ballard's expedition recorded Yudachi when the wreck was already 50 years old. Vulcan returned in 2015 and added another observation point. Nautilus returned in 2025 with sonar and high-resolution ROV imagery and documented a further stage of deterioration. A future expedition may see something different again. This is why the 2025 mission did not need to recover an artifact to achieve something important. Raising an object is one way to preserve material. Recording a site before it changes is another. The Nautilus team mapped geometry that future researchers can compare. They filmed structures that may eventually fall. They documented where recognizable pieces still sat in relation to one another. And because Yudachi had been surveyed before, they could do more than describe the wreck. They could demonstrate change. That is the real value of returning to known wrecks. A first discovery answers one question: what is here? A later survey can ask another: what has happened since? On Yudachi, the answer is visible in the gap between the older records and the 2025 imagery. The wreck recorded in 2025 was far less structurally coherent than the one documented in 1992. The aft gun had fallen to port. The stern was fully collapsed. The torpedo launcher positions remained among the most useful landmarks precisely because so much of the ship around them had deteriorated. The destroyer had not vanished, but its readability was being lost. That loss has another consequence. Every collapsed deck can obscure what lies below it. Every fallen structure can bury smaller objects. Every area that settles into sediment becomes harder to interpret from outside. The longer the process continues, the more difficult it may become to distinguish one compartment from another, or to connect scattered pieces back to the layout of the original vessel. In other words, deterioration does not only destroy steel, it can destroy context. That is why comparison records matter. The hand drawings made after the 1992 expedition now preserve relationships that are harder to see on the wreck itself. The sonar data collected in 2025 preserves another version of those relationships. The ROV video adds close detail. None of these records is the wreck, but together they preserve information that the wreck may no longer display clearly in the future. There is an irony in that. Yudachi was built as a fast warship, a machine whose value depended on movement. Her final battle lasted only hours. Her destruction at the surface came quickly. But her disappearance as a recognizable object on the seabed is happening on a completely different timescale. No explosion marks the moment when a deck finally gives way. No crew is present when a gun slowly loses support and falls. no single expedition can watch the entire process. Researchers only return years apart and compare what the sea has left them. In 1992, they saw one version of Yudachi. In 2015, another team saw another. In 2025, Nautilus found a wreck that was still identifiable, still historically legible, but visibly more collapsed. And the survey itself has now become part of the same timeline. If another ROV returns decades from now, the 2025 sonar map and video may serve the same purpose that the Ballard era records served for Nautilus. They will show not only where Yudachi was, they will show what Yudachi still was. The wreck beneath Iron Bottom Sound will continue to change whether anyone is watching or not. But the record does not have to disappear with it. More than 30 years after Ballard's expedition, a hand drawing still holds the outline of a destroyer. On the seabed, that outline is fading,